Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I saw a panel discussion just a week or so ago about what's going on in Quebec right now and its impact on Canada and politics, and thought that it'd be really interesting to check in with one of the panelists as to what was said and what he thinks and what is going on in Quebec right now. So we're joined by Sébastien Dallaire. Sébastien is the executive vice president at Léger, Canada's largest independent market research and analytics firm. He's got over 25 years of experience in public opinion research, and he's recognized as one of Canada's leading experts in understanding citizens and voters' attitudes and behaviors. He's covered Quebec provincial election nights on CTV since 2014 and is a regular commentator on provincial and national media outlets. Right now, what's going on in Quebec is fascinating. The Bloc Québécois obviously is still a very big presence in the federal government and potentially could play an even bigger role given the minority parliament that we're in and the NDP that are not currently as supportive of the Liberal government as they have been in the past. We thought they had gone away, but it appears that they are strengthening. And the Parti Québécois, which I thought was gone, appears to have come back. And then somebody told me just last week that don't be surprised if the Liberal Party wins Quebec again. So what the heck is going on in Quebec right now, Mr. Sébastien Dallaire? What's going on?
It's a good question. Our politics tend to be, from an outsider's perspective, looking in, like it's a bit topsy-turvy. It's hard to follow, and there have been a lot of ups and downs for sure over the past couple of decades. And as you said, parties that we thought were basically dead just not only reappeared, but are now either they have the most seats in the province or are leading in the polls. So it is a bit difficult to follow, and I think it's important to take the time to disentangle a lot of it, because while we have sovereigntist parties now in the lead, both provincially and federally in the province, it's not really a reflection of Quebecers' views on sovereignty itself or on another referendum. So that adds a layer of complexity to this entire analysis. So it's definitely not simple.
So they're more nationalist, less sovereigntist?
Yeah, you could say it that way. It's a different the nationalist axis, if we can call it that way. So if we take a step back and look at politics in Quebec in the 70s, 80s, 90s, it tended to be driven by the combination of two axes. One was the axis that we know elsewhere in North America and in Western Europe, mostly a left-right or conservative liberal axis. But with that one, you always had a yes or no axis, which is, are you favorable towards sovereignty or not? And that drove Quebec politics. And provincially, you had the PQ on one side, the Liberal Party on the other side. And federally, until the Bloc appeared in the mid-90s, the dynamic was a little bit different, because there was no clear yes, no. All federal parties were obviously not in favor of Quebec sovereignty. So it always created a strange dynamic. But since then, this yes-no axis, which was pretty clear, has transformed or morphed into something much more complicated, that some people, could be nationalist and want to take stronger positions on Quebec identity, language laws, but yet still be opposed to sovereignty. So this has gotten a lot more complicated. And so you could, in a way, add a third layer in addition to the yes-no, which is views on Canadian cultural and immigration policies, multiculturalism versus what in Quebec a lot of people talk about, interculturalism. How do we deal with cultural and linguistic differences in a world where you're not attached to either a position on, yes, I want sovereignty, or no, I don't want sovereignty? So it's really complicated things in many ways.
So let's break it down for people that may not understand the politics and the positioning completely. Your current government is the CAQ, and I didn't think they were sovereigntist, but I thought they were pretty nationalistic, and I didn't think they were centrist. I thought they were right wing. Tell me where you would position the CAQ.
Yeah, I think most people would say, and if we looked at left-right politics, probably center-right somewhere in there, economically for sure, small c conservative, in many ways resembling maybe the blue Tories of the past, if we think more Canada-wide. But so sorry, red Tories of the past, blue Tories, sorry about that. So red Tories of the past. So small c conservative, but not necessarily very conservative socially. And what makes the CAQ so unique is the name. CAQ stands for Coalition, Coalition Avenir Québec. So a coalition of sovereigntists and federalists, to use the old labels that were used in the province before, to say at the time, let's not talk about Quebec sovereignty, about referendums. Let's not talk about whether you want Quebec to leave Canada or have any kind of discussions about constitutional politics. Let's focus on the economy. And that was how the CAQ was created by François Legault. He wanted to have some sort of moratorium on talking about anything related to Quebec independence to focus on fixing the economy and fixing what was seen to be hailing the province in terms of productivity, just, getting higher wages, improving Quebec's economic situation. But over time, the CAQ got more and more entangled into identity politics on it with his views on immigration, Bill 21 on secularism. And so identity politics has dominated most of the CAQ's terms, leaving aside obviously the pandemic, which has changed everything for all governments. But there's been a lot of discussion about identity politics and relationships with Ottawa and struggles over who has the power to do what on immigration, for example. So, despite their name and despite their stance saying we're not going to talk about sovereignty, the CAQ constantly stepped into debates that, in many ways, helped the PQ come back because they've been constantly picking fights with Ottawa and they've been constantly trying to drive wedges between the different parties that have, in a way, resurrected some of the discussions about Quebec sovereignty.
So this is strange. So it's a center right party that was maybe not sovereignty oriented, but very nationalistic oriented, or what you would describe as identity politics. And what they did is they actually brought back the Parti Québécois. So where is the room for the Parti Québécois? It's sovereigntist, but left wing?
That's also where it's complicated because again, the left-right comes across other axes that have a lot of importance. And so on some issues, the PQ remains a little bit more left-wing. It used to be more of a social democratic party, but the PQ splintered also in, late 90s, early 2000s with people who eventually formed Québec Solidaire, which was the farther to the left sovereigntist party and who over time evolved into kind of a party that has been winning steadily, many seats on the Montreal Island, and has garnered a lot of support with younger voters, more environmentally driven voters, and definitely more to the left, but not necessarily sovereigntist. So it's a party that has really taken away some of the sovereigntist support, yet it's really unclear to what their voter base really is like. And so the PQ ended up, by comparison, moving to the right somewhat. So on its while it is probably more to the left than the CAQ on economic policies and on various social issues, it had also taken a stance that could be seen as more right wing on issues related to immigration, language protection, and everything that relates to Quebec identity, which creates a very interesting situation where in Quebec there's some academic research that shows that often secularism and anti-religious views are often tied to more left-wing politics, which is really different from what you will find anywhere else in North America or Europe.
So is there room for the Parti Québécois, the CAQ, and the Quebec Solidaire?
There is room, but they can't all fight for the same voter base. So because as at the very early in our discussion, I was mentioning that support for sovereignty has not risen, and it's kind of stuck at around 35, 37%, depending on polls. And that base of sovereigntist voter is a bit divided right now. And when you look at voters of the PQ and of Quebec Solidaire, it's clear that they're not getting support strictly from sovereigntists. So what does that mean moving forward? The PQ has in its political stance very clear ideas about obviously Quebec independence, but also even when you look at the leader's position over what they would do if they win a mandate in 2 years when the elections are due, they want to run on the idea of having a referendum on sovereignty right away. Yet a quarter of their voters are saying they're not in favor of Quebec sovereignty. And as I said, for Quebec Solidaire, same problem. But even worse, Quebec Solidaire's majority of their voters are not sovereigntists. So once this idea really comes to the forefront again, and they start talking about sovereignty in the context of an election campaign, what's going to happen?
Will one
And that's
party
the big question
dedicate
mark for them.
itself, commit itself to holding another referendum?
Yes, it has. We'll see if that holds as they're getting closer to an election and that hot potato becomes a lot more visible. Now you can keep it, on the back seat because you don't really need to talk about sovereignty so much at this point because you're riding high in the polls, and you're riding high in the polls mostly because voters are dissatisfied with the outgoing, with the incumbent CAQ government.
Freudian
So
slip, outgoing.
sorry, Freudian stuff. Yeah, so I wouldn't say outgoing. Right now, if an election were held today, it
It
would
would be.
likely be outgoing, because they're really not very popular right now. So the PQ will have a major challenge, and so will Quebec Solidaire in the upcoming election in a couple of years, because they will need to defend their stance on sovereignty with a voter base that is not convinced at all that this is the best solution moving forward. So it will be very interesting to see what happens.
We're having an interesting discussion today about what's going on in Quebec politics. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back in just 2 minutes with Sébastien Dallaire. Stay with us, everybody. Back in two. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. My guest tonight is Sébastien Dallaire. He is the Executive Vice President at Leger, Canada's largest independent market research and analytics firm. He's got 25 years of experience in public opinion research, and he was on a panel in Toronto recently in the Albany Club, let alone a conservative bastion of politics, talking about the role of Quebec in Canada and what's going on with Quebec politics. So I thought it would be really helpful and interesting to check in with him. Mr. Dallaire, I've been hearing a lot about the Liberal Party in Quebec, and maybe that's because I probably talked to too many Anglophones on the West Island. But I have been talking about a leadership contest and some people that have put their name forward, and that it could create some resurgence. And then as well, somebody told me don't think the Conservative Party is dead. Could come back just like it did in British Columbia. So tell me, if you could, about the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party in provincial politics in Quebec.
Yeah. So the Liberal Party in Quebec, just like, let's say, the PQ a few years back, were kind of left for dead after the last election, and they've been clearly struggling with Francophone voters in the province. It's been really hard for the Liberal Party to reconnect after a few years of struggles, engaging in discussions where they were on the right side of a lot of wedges that were thrown in by other parties with CAQ, mostly, where the Liberal Party ended up taking positions that were unpopular with Francophone voters. And it's been difficult for them to really find a foothold. But we're seeing now that although the PQ is ahead in the polls and they have a steady and comfortable lead over the CAQ and the Liberals and others below, uh, It's mostly a vote that is based on dissatisfaction with the incumbent government, more so than really alignment with the PQ's core policies, especially independence. And when we asked Quebec voters how they would vote if we throw in hypothetical new leaders for the Liberal Party, what we see is the arrival of Pablo Rodriguez really changes the dynamics. When we ask voters if Pablo Rodriguez becomes the new leader, who would you vote for among the following list? When you do that, the Liberals become serious contenders again. Just having this new potential leaders completely changes the dynamic. And obviously, this remains hypothetical, and a lot of water will go under the bridge before the next election. And of course, Mr. Rodriguez needs to win uh, the leadership race for that to happen. But it just shows that voters are looking for an alternative to the CAQ, and they're not too sure which way to go. Right now, they're looking at the PQ, but clearly they're not wedded to that idea this time, because when we throw in a new contender with a new leader, they are clearly looking that way. We're seeing a 10 to 12 point bump in favor of the Liberal Party
10
just
to
by
12
changing the
points
name.
just because of one new leader. That's
Yes,
amazing. And when
yeah.
is the election, and are there other candidates?
Well, the election would be in 2 years, so it would be
No,
in
sorry, the
2026.
leadership election.
Oh, it's in May. It's in May. So the real race starts in January. So that's where voters will really get a real glimpse at what the party's positions will be on various issues, what the various leadership candidates' positions will be. And the challenge for the new Liberal leader will be to find a more comfortable position between defending the rights of the Anglophone minority in Quebec and allophones and immigrants who haven't been getting a really good press recently from the CAQ, from the PQ. A lot of harder debates about immigration in the province, and especially with regards to protecting the French language. So the new liberal leader will need to find a clear position that more francophone voters can relate to if it wants to have success. So that exact positioning will be very important. Will say a lot and how the Liberal parties will do in upcoming election. But it's as your friend had mentioned, or your friend or someone you said someone had mentioned to you that the Liberals could be a contender in the next election. Clearly not impossible. A lot has to happen for that to be reality, but it's not impossible. Voters are really looking in different directions, and their vote is parked for now, but it's not solid.
Now, Pablo Rodriguez has some national, federal experience and an image. I had the opportunity to do some work with him and was really quite impressed with him. But does he have a reputation and involvement in Quebec?
What is interesting is when we ask Quebec voters how they feel about his arrival and then do they have a positive or a negative opinion of him, uh, is positive far outweigh the negative, and it's almost like a 4-to-1 ratio, if I recall correctly, which is quite impressive for any politician, but also a politician that has been around for a long time and that is fairly well known, even though federal politics in Quebec is not as salient as provincial politics. So federal politicians don't get as much visibility in the province as they do elsewhere in Canada because there's a lot more focus on provincial politics here. But despite that, he's very well known by most voters and they like him. So some of the unpopularity of the current Trudeau government doesn't seem to be really affecting public opinion about Mr. Rodriguez provincially. So he's been able to, cut it both ways. So you have he's seen to have had a lot of success in federal politics, yet he doesn't seem to be carrying the baggage of the Trudeau government so far. We'll see if that changes now that the spotlights will be on him for a few months. So right now it's been a fairly easy entry onto provincial politics and fairly positive reviews from voters. We'll see how that changes once he becomes a lot more visible provincially, and we certainly can expect that his opponents are going to start attacking him on his role with a government that is not popular in Quebec right now, and it's not popular anywhere in Canada right now.
I didn't even know there was a Conservative Party provincially in Quebec, but then again, there wasn't one in British Columbia either. And because of the popularity, well, I don't know, is it the popularity of Pierre Poilievre or the unpopularity of Justin Trudeau? I'm not sure, but the Conservative Party in British Columbia came from nowhere, like really, literally nowhere, to almost winning the provincial election. So, what's the chance that the Conservative Party in Quebec could actually be a player?
Conservative Party in Quebec, it's interesting because it had a very different brand than the Conservative Party elsewhere. Because for decades, the Quebec Conservative Party, although it existed, it was on most ballots. It wasn't really part of the Quebec provincial scene because historically, the conservative progressive axis, as I was saying, was really blurred and in many ways overtaken by the yes no axis. So what happened is it was never really, you didn't really have a conservative party from a pure brand conservative party perspective, wasn't really present in Quebec. But you had parties with conservative views. Obviously, Maurice Duplessis was in many ways a conservative premier. He was the longest serving premier in Quebec, 36 to 39, then 1944 to 1959 consecutively. But his party wasn't the Conservative Party; it was Union Nationale, but it was blue. It was, blue conservative, and the old saying back then was, heaven is blue and hell is red, referring to the liberals. So there was, in many ways, a conservative versus liberal split. It's just different names. But what happened is after the pandemic, a new leader, Éric Duhem, who was a popular radio host, popular newspaper commentator on the right side of the spectrum, took over the party and was really able to galvanize some of the anger that we saw during the pandemic. So people who were opposed to government measures, more libertarian in nature. He was able to really galvanize that anger and all of a sudden create some support for the Conservative Party of Quebec and managed to, perform quite well in the election, despite the fact that they won no seats. They had almost as many votes as Quebec Solidaire and were not far from the Quebec Liberal Party as well. The question is, can they now build over that, what remains a fairly small base? Are they now able to garner more support in mainstream politics? Coming in with a very hard right platform, trying to tap into this anger, uh, worked, and that now the party is part of the discussion. Can they now move to policy positions and other, positions in other areas where they really connect with the mainstream voters in a way that transforms them into a real power in the province? So far, it hasn't happened. Is it possible? Yes, it's possible. It's hard to see them winning a lot of seats in the upcoming election simply because they don't really have a team. It's the leader, but people don't know anything else about any other party members. It doesn't have a big structure because it doesn't have much funding for now. So it will take time to build, but there is a Conservative Party of Quebec now, and that's quite new. It hadn't really existed. It was there, but mostly in name only. Now it's there. The question is, can it gain really the permanent basis of support and build an infrastructure to help it win seats in upcoming elections? That's what remains to be seen.
So maybe I'm naive, but what you said was only 31% of the population supports separation. And so if you've got the Parti Québécois, the CAQ, and the Quebec Solidaire all sort of competing for the nationalistic slash separatist vote, it seems like you've got three parties competing for 31% of the vote. And if anything, what you also said was that the CAQ is center right and the Conservative Party is clearly blue. So that if anything, the Conservatives will take support away from the CAQ and the party, and certainly not from the PQ or the Quebec Solidaire, since they're so left wing. So that would suggest the CAQ will do worse because of splinter. Doesn't that mean that the 69% of people that are not supportive of separation will tend to vote for the Liberal Party?
I wish I could say it were that simple, but because of this kind of multi-directional axes cutting across all of this, it is unfortunately not that simple. It's 35%, so a little bit more than 31, so around 35%. You're right. They are split across multiple parties, and where they stand federally and provincially is sometimes hard to follow. So it does mean that for parties that are not favorable to sovereignty, so the Liberal Party being one of them, the Conservative Party being another one, the CAQ, it's while they're not favorable, François Legault used to be a PQ minister and was used to be one of the most dominant voices in favor of sovereignty. So the CAQ does have some sovereigntist vote as well. So it's a bit complicated to split. But what's going to be really what makes it difficult for any party to really federate either all sovereigntist or all non-sovereigntist vote. Obviously, the basin is bigger on the non-sovereigntist side, is that you have to account for language politics. So Quebec voters, Francophone Quebec voters who are not in favor of sovereignty, most of them are still concerned about the future of the French language. They're still concerned about the idea of maybe loosening up some language laws in the province, and which is what the Liberal Party wants to do, and all of its leadership candidates have said they would want to think about to not be as restrictive. So it's always a very slippery terrain for the Liberal Party. So trying to keep their base of Anglophone and more multicultural voters while not completely losing the Francophone vote is always a very difficult task for the Liberal Party. And that's what they've been struggling with in recent years. And then the CAQ trying to cut it both ways is obviously struggling right now, trying to say, don't worry about the sovereignty issue. We have better things to talk about, but yet they're raising issues with the federal government on immigration. And while they're doing this, they're saying, we want more power. The federal government is saying no, and it allows the PQ to say, hey, by the way, you're not succeeding with the federal government because the solution is Quebec independence. And the CAQ ends up basically stuck in its own wedges. So they're trying to create a wedge, but they're stuck in the middle, and they don't really have a clear position. So what do we do now that we know the federal government is not going to give you full power on some issues? No matter how you look at that issue, it's not as simple as saying you have 65% of the vote that is not sovereigntist, therefore the Liberal Party should be able to win that 65%. Yeah,
well, and
it doesn't really work that way.
With five parties that are all competitive, you could win with something in the 30%, if not even the low 30% area. And so it's
which has been the norm for a long time in Quebec. Most governments, if you look, since the 1990s, have been winning with 32, 35, 37, 38. You don't have a lot of elections where parties will go above 40%. It tends to be very tight.
Unbelievable. We got to take a break for some messages and come back, and we're going to ask our guest, what about federal politics in Quebec? Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. The topic tonight is Quebec and what the heck is going on. Our guest is Sébastien Dallaire. He is the executive vice president at Dallaire, Canada's largest independent market research and analytics firm. We've just spent the last half hour talking about provincial politics in Quebec, but the federal politics is just, if not as much, split. Tell us about, the Bloc Québécois seems to still dominate. And it's amazing to me that it does, if, again, only 35% of the population support separation. But the Conservatives have come back big time, have they not?
They have come back. I don't know that I would say big time yet. They've come back in the discussion. They've risen a few points. What has really changed in terms of Quebec vote federally is that now because the Liberals have gone down so much, so that's the variable that has changed a lot more. So the Liberals have gone down significantly, and they're now tied with the Conservatives in second place. And the Bloc has basically been stable. They've risen a little bit, but the Bloc is now comfortably in first place in the province, and Conservatives and Liberals are tied in second place. So that's very different. It changes the discussion because now the Conservatives are all of a sudden competitive. So they've grown a little bit, but they haven't taken the extra step needed to win a lot more seats in the province. So that's what's going to be interesting in coming months. Will the Conservatives be able to really gain a stronger foothold in the province and win more seats? Right now, it remains a question mark, but they are definitely part of the discussion, which is quite different from what we've seen in the previous couple of election cycles.
Tell me a little bit about the Bloc Québécois and why it does so well.
It's a very again, I hate to say it's complicated when we think about Quebec, but we don't need to go too far back to remember the Bloc Québécois being almost dead. Like a lot of people thought it would disappear after what happened in 2011 with the Orange Crush in the province, where the Bloc Québécois lost almost all of its seats. I think they had 4 left after 2011. It was difficult. Gilles Duceppe came back to try to, resuscitate the party. Didn't really work. And then you got new leader now in Yves-François Blanchet. And actually, what helped the Bloc really come back is identity politics. The Bloc was on the right side of many issues and policies that really hurt other federal parties provincially, namely Bill 21 on secularism in the province, where the Bloc it was much easier for the Bloc to say, hey, we're highly favorable towards that policy, whereas other federal parties had to contend with the reality that you can't, you need to listen to what your voters are saying nationally, and Bill 21 wasn't popular federally. So it really allowed the Bloc Québécois. You have that issue, you had immigration, you have many other wedge issues related to Quebec identity, obviously language laws as well, that allowed the Bloc to play in many ways alone on the ice rink, with other parties basically standing on the side, fighting for what was left. So it has made it difficult for other parties to really fight with the Bloc on on a level playing field. But we'll see what happens with a future federal campaign in Quebec. Will identity politics play a big role again? It's likely that it will, and when it happens, it clearly helps the Bloc, and it's difficult for other parties.
So the Conservative Party, with its new leader, appears to be really trying to position itself positively in Quebec. Held the big convention in Quebec. Is talking about his French Canadian last name, even though he grew up in Ontario and mostly Alberta. Is it working?
Somewhat. So the party, as I said, is now tied in second place. They're not much higher than they used to be, but they are higher. So mid to low 20s. Can they go above that? And that's what we will see in coming months. What the Conservative Party and Pierre Poilievre need to do is really show Quebecers That is, it is really focusing on issues that are important to them. It is succeeding with its economic message. So the main message of the Conservative Party elsewhere in Canada, there's no reason for that message to not work in Quebec. You know, inflation affected voters the same way. All pocketbook issues affected Quebec voters the same way. The Liberal government is not extremely popular in Quebec either. So a lot of the same underlying factors are there. For any federal party to succeed, they also need to show that they have a strong Quebec presence, that they have a strong Francophone presence in the province, that they have leaders here to really be the voice of the Conservative Party in the province. And that's what has been missing so far. So voters have heard a lot about Pierre Poilievre, and his French is good, but he's not from here, is not part of Quebec politics. He's not someone that is really well known in the province. And so therefore, he hasn't been able to really connect with Quebec voters the same way he has connected with voters elsewhere in Canada. So will they take that extra step? Will they really be able to convince Quebec voters that they are on the same side? And that's what's left to be done right now.
But I guess with your comment about inflation and some of the fiscal issues, as well as your reference to the success of the Union Nationale for such a long time, there really is conservative. There really are conservative thinking people in Quebec.
Oh, absolutely, there are, and the CAQ has won with some, again, mostly small C conservative policies and ideas in recent years. So it shows that there is potential for a conservative resurgence in the province. It's a matter of showing that they understand Quebecers, that they can connect with Quebec voters. On some policy issues, it's obviously going to be more difficult. Quebec voters tend to be more concerned with climate change. So the axe to tax message can have some success in the province because it's not all Quebec voters who will prioritize climate change. A party that comes in with policies that are clearly much further to the right than most Quebec voters tend to create a little bit more resistance in the province. So it's going to be convince Quebec voters that put priority on the taxation message, don't focus so much on the climate change angle. And you could go down the list of many policy areas where the Conservatives will have some work to do. Where Pierre Poilievre probably did a better job than Andrew Scheer and Aaron O'Toole before him, he has taken a much stronger stance on an issue that really hurt previous two leaders, and that was abortion. His position on abortion is a lot clearer. And if anything, Pierre Poilievre cannot be accused of being soft on any of his views, right? He's someone with very strong views. So when he says, I'm not going to reopen that debate, even if some party members want to, I am not going to pass any legislation on it, Quebec voters are more likely to give him the benefit of the doubt on that one, which they didn't do with Aaron O'Toole and Andrew Scheer, who stumbled with that issue in Quebec in the past.
I had an interesting conversation with some people about the Liberal Party just last week, where they said that Trudeau stepping down and the Liberal Party being led by Chrystia Freeland or Mark Carney might be positive in the rest of Canada. It would be a disaster in Quebec. Tell me, is Trudeau popular in Quebec? And what if there was a new Anglophone leader, not from Quebec, of the Liberal Party? What would happen to the Liberals' prospects in Quebec?
What is interesting when we look at Trudeau's popularity in the province is he never enjoyed the real highs of Trudeau mania the way it happened elsewhere in Canada when he was first elected in 2015, especially if you look in Ontario and in Atlantic Canada, where Justin Trudeau was extremely popular. In Quebec, he was popular and he did win a lot more seats than previous leaders in the province, but it wasn't a red wave in Quebec the same way it happened elsewhere. He was popular, but it wasn't the same kind of highly emotional response to his presence, and therefore he didn't go from a very high point to a very low point. Quebec voters actually remained fairly consistent in their views of Justin Trudeau. It has been, views of him have become less positive, but they're not as bad as what we are measuring elsewhere in Canada. So he went from, fairly positive starting point, but not very positive, to a less positive one. So the fact that he's from here clearly means that his floor is probably a bit higher than other leaders. Would a change of leadership, having someone who's not from Quebec in there, would that change the dynamics? What it could create is indeed a little bit more competition for votes in the province among some voters who feel more comfortable with having a leader from Quebec, a francophone leader. Now you would have leaders from the two main national parties without a strong Quebec presence, at least at the leadership level. Would that change the dynamic? Possibly. Remains to be seen. But you're right that what it could do is it could lower the floor for the Liberals, and we saw that with Michael Ignatieff, for example, where the Liberals really struggled to retain some of their seats in 2011. Was a very, very rough election for the Liberals in the province. Was it based on language or just the Liberal Party not able to connect? It was a complex election as well, but it does raise some of those challenges for the Liberals in Quebec for sure.
Could the orange wave happen again?
Highly unlikely. What really created the orange wave was just a confluence of events. But Jack Layton has been around for a while. Jack Layton was someone who was able to connect with Quebec voters based on, yes, on the party's values for sure, but also on the fact that had been many years of buildup in the province where Tom Mulcair was the Quebec lieutenant, had become more popular himself over the years. And the combo of Jack Layton with Tom Mulcair was a strong one for Quebec, because Jack Layton also grew up in part in Montreal and was able to speak to Quebecers in a way that made him look like he was from here. He was someone who could connect with Quebecers. And in 2011, he was really able to galvanize support through strong media performances, strong debate performances, at a time where voters were looking for an alternative. They didn't want to go the way of the Liberals, but they also did not want to vote for Stephen Harper back then. And the NDP was in the best place, best time, and they ended up getting this massive wave of support that came from seemingly out of nowhere. They were surprised by it as much as commentators were surprised by it. But the same conditions just don't exist right now. And it's unlikely that Jagmeet Singh could be able to garner the same level of support because it'd be much harder for him to say that he's from Quebec and that he really connects with Quebec voters. He doesn't have a lot, it doesn't check a lot of the same boxes.
It is interesting in Quebec politics for the rest of Canada, where we've got 2 or 3 parties, and we don't have this separation versus, federalism, crosshatch on the left-right spectrum. And as you say, you can get elected in the 30s, and it sort of means all bets are off, and it can be very volatile. We're going to take a final break and come back with one last question for our guest before we let him go. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. My guest is Sébastien Dallaire, EVP at Léger, Canada's largest market research firm. I got to ask you one last quick question, if I could, Mr. Dallaire. Does Trump change things at all?
He could. What we saw is in the past few weeks, he has affected Quebec politics in a way that so far has been probably a little bit more positive for Justin Trudeau, because it has allowed Justin Trudeau to switch channels from struggles at home to now being the person trying to shore up Canada against what are threats from a future Trump presidency. So it allowed Justin Trudeau to look like the leader in Canada right now, which is something that's been really hard for him to do recently because it's been one problem after another. And when you've been in power for so long, your baggage becomes harder to shed. And having Trump now gives Mr. Trudeau a more useful foil or point of comparison for him that allows him to show that no, I'm the defender of Canada's interest. I'm in charge, and that has changed the narrative a little bit. We'll see if that changes anything in terms of voting intentions. Too early to know, but it has made it a bit more difficult for Pierre Poilievre, and we saw that Pierre Poilievre, maybe for the first time in a long time, has been more on the defensive because he has been accused of not towing the line and of not putting Canada ahead of his partisan needs, and so it has put Pierre Poilievre in a strange and difficult position where he needs to show support for Justin Trudeau to show that we are all in this together to try to defend Canada. That's very hard to do if you're the opposition leader and you're ahead in the polls.
I
So
was at a interesting speech by David Frum, who this past week said that the worst that Trump is as much of a threat to Canada as our negative perception of what the threat could be is. So he was very concerned about the threat to Canada and said this is the worst possible time to try to score partisan political benefits, that we've got to be on Team Canada. And the last thing you want to do or should do is put all the blame on another political leader. Because we've got to be working on this together to counter the threat that Trump's there. One person's view, but it was an interesting view. Sébastien Dallaire, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
my pleasure.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online, even from Montreal, at www.saga960am.ca. Thanks very much. Good night, everybody.